Hello, Professor Krum. My name is Leonardo Araujo, and I wanted to do my second teach back on young children spontaneously create core properties of a language in a new modality. One of the biggest reasons why I decided to choose this article was the fact of sign language. I know that we've talked about linguistics before, and in my previous presentation on my Teach Back 1, I discussed uh, verbal language. So I wanted to kind of, keep going with that same topic, but this time discuss um, sign language. And as well as in your presentation and as in one of my articles, I also discovered two studies done on Nicaraguan sign language, and those really interested me a lot, especially how a new language is developed. Similarly, compared to this article on young children creating core properties of a language, they tie in pretty well together. So I think it comes along as a good presentation and a good way of understanding sign language as a whole. So I wanted to talk about the basis of the study on this article. And so, with the rise of new languages emerging, a lot of scientists and a lot of people want to understand the dynamics of language evolution. Unfortunately, though, people aren't getting aware of these languages after they're done. They're not seeing the magic happen. They're not seeing the hard work and effort put into creating a new language. That's what's missing. And so what this study tries to do is tries to highlight the process at hand using children in a controlled environment. And in this environment, children are asked to depict pictures to one another without using verbal language. And what they found out that within 30 minutes, the children were able to create a communication system with core features. And at the end, the results suggested that children have the skills to understand new language, as we already know. We already understand that. And this topic will also get addressed in my second article. But they're also able to create a new one. And so, because of this, implications of previous theories of language evolution that were once thought can take up to generations or even millennia are now being challenged because of what these scientists were able to see within these children under 30 minutes. And also the Nicaraguan Sign Language can perhaps help this theory of evolution. So it's kind of contradicting in both ways. You have one says, look, we did this stuff in 30 minutes and look what these children are doing. But then if you look at the Nicaraguan Sign Languages, especially how it's being developed from generation to generation, it also benefits the language evolution theory of language taking a few generations to fully develop. And so perhaps I think this study is not necessarily discrediting language evolution. It can help it, and I think that's a better way of seeing it than saying language evolution is being debunked because of this study. That's my implications and that's my thoughts on it. So the experiment at work. So like I said, the children were asked to describe a picture to one another without using any spoken language. The children were able to use any themes that were seemed helpful. And during this experiment, the observers tested the core properties of a language. We'll get into it right now. First of all, we have referentiability, which is referring to things using simple words. Conventionality, speakers within a community use the same sign for a given referent. Pretty much, if I say a dog, you know what I'm talking about because we as a society have come together in English and said, yes, a dog is this four-legged mammal. Arbitrariness is the absence of connection between word sound and meaning, and grammatical structure is the meaning of sentences based on structure of words. And this is pretty straightforward things here on the core properties of language, and we'll discuss these and the evidence, not the evidence, but the outcomes they found out about these core properties in the experiment that they conducted with the children. Excuse me. So this was the setup in the study. As you can see, there was children on each side of a wall, and there was a camera depicting one another to each other. And on each other's left or right-hand side, there was a wheel that had to be spun. And whatever picture the wheel chose is a picture that they had to depict to one another. And this was done in multiple successions, multiple rounds, and children of different ages as well. And so these were some of the results of the experiment conducted. So they found out two substantial discoveries. One, that after the students switched roles, it was easier for them to establish a way to refer to the pictures. So after one student went, the second one went. It was pretty easy for them to distinguish what was what. Second, after conducting the experiment multiple times, they concluded that children generally depicted the content of the picture in a way that was comprehensible to their partner. So after the third one, it was easier because they were able to, mentally agree that when I do this, it means small. When I do this, it means small. that agreement had already been made. So when they did it again, it's like, oh, it's the small house, for example. And in relation to the properties of a language, they concluded the following. When it comes to referentiability, the researchers implemented abstract concepts for children to explain. And what they did was, in the wheel, there was a blank spot, and this blank spot meant nothing. And they didn't tell the children, it just meant nothing. So the children had to, they picked one another an abstract concept like nothing. And so with it, they would just shake their hands, they would just say nothing, they would do nothing, and that would convey it was nothing. And so the children were successfully able to communicate more abstract concepts using newly created gestures. Conventionality, they wanted to test this. And so what they did is they compared groups' language to other groups. And the result was, as the sender generally comprehended signs that they had used, copying greatly increased successful communication. So perhaps they picked up an easier way to describe something. Probably they got it sooner and they said, okay, this kid is onto something. He's onto something better than what I'm doing. Let's take it and use it to forward our progression. And arbitrariness, they compare the first and last gestures for a given picture from each child. The result, the arbitrariness depended on how often it had been used rather than the age of the gesture or the gesturer. In grammatical structure, researchers found out that overall variation rather than present principles characterized children's creation of gestures sequence, showing that children spontaneously structure their gestures to solve a communicative problem. So that's it for this experiment that was done, and we'll talk about our 3 articles moving forward. So like I said, I saw the presentation that you did on your lecture, Professor Krum, and I wanted to touch upon more of this Nicaraguan Sign Language because for me it was really interesting. During the semester, I've also been doing some research in Nicaragua as a country from my political science course, so any chance I can get to talk about some Latin American country, I'm all in. And so first we'll start on with this article, Children Creating Properties of Language in Nicaragua. Since the 1979, a new sign language has risen from a deaf community in Nicaragua. These Nicaraguans had no prior exposure to a developed language prior to creating their own. And so what this article does is discusses discoveries made in the language properties as they emerge, as these people go from having no language to having a fundamentally a stable language. So what was interesting about this was that being deaf in Nicaragua was almost seen as taboo. A lot of Latin American countries have this taboo stigma toward disabilities or sexual orientations, things out of your nature that one perhaps cannot fully control. They're seen as taboo. And up until the 1970s, being deaf, you were pretty much confined to home and home sign. And home sign, it was just a language you had between you and perhaps your parents, and you only knew what was going on. But God forbid you were stuck at the store and you were deaf. You pretty much had luck then. And so because of that, many were isolated and an official language was never developed. Up until the mid-1980s, though, deaf schools were established, and thanks to that, Nicaraguan Sign Languages was formed. And due to its fresh start, the most avid speakers are younger ones. And because of this, you discussed it in your lecture, but as the Nicaraguan Sign Language was formed in the 1970s, it was very robust. It was very rustic. And, as those people that learned that language in 1970 grew older and grew older, they only got what they learned. And as the younger children came in and into a new language, they picked up the pieces that was left for them. And with those pieces, they were able to create better things. Like the example you used with Legos, they had some Legos there, and perhaps they had their own Legos from perhaps their own home sign language, and they came in, brought it together, and they just kept building upon building from generation to generation. This perhaps also proves and ties into language evolution theories, which is like I commented earlier. And in an experiment, they got a cohort of about 30 Nicaraguans from the first generation, 1970s to 1980s, 1990s, and they were able to see the progression that was done. So what they resulted in was that children who learned Nicaraguan Sign Language after the 1980s seemed to be a more discrete and combinatorial system. Also, learning mechanisms influence as long as their children are able to pick up the language. Like I said, the more children you have per generation, if Nicaragua keeps having deaf children, Nicaraguan Sign Language is only being proven to progress exponentially. And Nicaraguan Sign Language also shows that human learning abilities are capable of creating a new language to a point where there wasn't even one. And because of this, they saw how older Nicaraguans who were deaf use the language. For example, they would use one sort of gesture to communicate emotion, whereas the younger generation would linearly stack them in a grammatical, structural way. Like in the core properties of a language to signify emotion. For example, uh, of early Nicaraguan Sign Language, earlier learner might use one gesture to convey a rolling stone, like in the article, whereas a younger Nicaraguan Sign Language user would first signify the stone and then rolling down. Sort of an A-B sort of concept that they had going on, which proved more fundamentally and which also worked. And you can also tie this into a trace model that we'll discuss as we discuss connectionism and how it is tied into sign language. And so our second one was the brain science of bilingualism. Although this one perhaps doesn't fully tie to sign language, it does tie into how our hearing, and especially for babies, is being used. You know, and I found this very interesting one, especially as again some of the evolution of language is progressing and the connectionism approach to it as we learn things from experience and the things that we experience. So like I said, this article examines the brain science behind why babies are so good at learning language. And to study this, they use a MEG, which is a magno I'm sorry, I can't say that, but it's a Meg, and it's pretty much a Meg. It's like a helmet, pretty much, and it can pinpoint accuracy. With pinpoint accuracy, it can measure magnetic changes given by active nerve cells. And also the MEG can precisely locate timing and location of brain activity. And there's no harm to it, so the babies can put on this helmet and there's absolutely no harm. And part of the research observed that brain activity in 11-month-old babies responds to language sound, which is very important. And how some babies were from bilingual homes and others were not affected this. And so they put on the helmet on these babies and they had perhaps their parents speaking to them in English. And so in one cohort, you had babies that were only bilingual and some that were monolingual. And the babies who only heard English up until 11 months only recognized English. The patterns in the brain that signify hearing of sound were only amplified during the English ones, whereas babies who are bilingual recognize both. So we can already see that from age 11, babies are already understanding language, which is incredible. And also the brain's response to English sounds were equally strong in bilingual and monolingual babies, indicating that these two groups of babies were learning to discern English sound at the same rate. So this can be interpreted in a few ways, but pretty much saying that speaking to your baby in two languages is not going to confuse them. This does not prove, though, that your baby will be bilingual from the start. You got to put in the time, you got to put in the effort to keep those patterns of English and Spanish going in a baby. Just you talking to it at birth, 11 months, you got to keep on doing the work. And I like it also because it debunks some of the myths when it comes to bilingualism and babies and children. People think that bilingual children lag behind their monolingual peers, which is not true. It's not true. Another one was that code switching is when you perhaps say you speak both Spanish and English at the same time. For example, when I say, oh, I want to go afuera. Afuera is outside in Spanish. That's code switching. And it's not bad, it's rather a strategical tool to employed by children who are bilingual. It's just you having a bigger in this example be a bigger toolbox to choose from. I can easily say outside and I can easily say afuera. I just use say afuera because perhaps I think it sounds better at that time. And so that was my second article. Really enjoy this one, and perhaps this is one of my favorite one. I really like the science behind the brain, and especially in babies and bilingualism. Find that fascinating. Article number 3, again, coming back to the Nicaraguan Sign Language approach. This one also did a similar thing. In this research article, investigated whether children show stronger tendencies to segment and linearize information in their communities, in the communication system rather than adolescents and adults do. And so by segmenting and linearizing, we mean that, for example, we have the word big shoe. These younger children in theory, from what these investigators are trying to see, is that they're first saying big in their sign language and then shoe. Whereas adolescents and adults are simply saying, have one sort of signal in their hands to signify a big shoe. And so what they did was, when a group of deaf children from a community, when they form a group of, when a group of deaf children from a community form a language, it's getting passed down from future generation. It will become a fully blown language, just like in the first article that we discussed. As long as there's deaf children in Nicaragua, Nicaraguan sign language will become a full blown language as each generation brings a new approach and more experiences, a more connectionist approach to it. Um, Older Nicaraguan Sign Language users express actions using single signs, and younger ones segment words linearly and order them in a grammatical structural way, abiding by the core properties of language. And again, pre-adolescent children are the primary driving force of change to Nicaraguan Sign Language. It's not the older generation, it's the newer generation that keeps bringing ideas because of experiences they had that's making a change to Nicaraguan Sign Languages. And so at the end of the study, the children were, to conduct the study, the children were asked to depict a motion event using only gestures. And what they found out was that young children, again, have a tendency to segment and linearize information when communicating. And one of the reasons why they do this is because in general, it's easier to understand to them. One doesn't necessarily know if I go like this. So for example, older generation users, when they would try to signify a rolling stone moving down, is they would start from an area like this and keep rolling their hand in a downward motion. One perhaps doesn't know what that is. You know what I mean? What can this mean? A lot of things. And so what the younger children are doing is they're segmenting their communication. First, they're making sure that you know what it is, a stone, right? Or perhaps a wheel. And then they're signifying that it's going down. Unlike the older generation, which simply have one gesture, these children are using segments and linearizing them, which is so much better and so much easier to understand for one another. And one of the driving factors was perhaps this is done because all languages are learned and therefore shaped by young children. And so this was Article 3, tries to examine the driving factors of the change, and at the end it concluded that it's the children themselves driving it. And so I think Article 3 and Article 1 relate very well, and by putting Article 2 in there with this, with the way babies are learning language, maybe we can tie that into how these younger children are learning sign language and driving it forward. Perhaps we're not seeing that done with a language like English. That's already been, it's already there. Been so long that these young children, their input and their the lives they're living, it's not adding much to the language. Although one can say though that as we do get older, there's been a lot of slang added to Webster's dictionary, a lot of words that perhaps weren't invented up until now. So you can still see that young children still have a driving force to their language, but not as big as it is to a new developed language like Nicaraguan Sign Language. And so we'll talk about the connectionism approach next. And so first we want to establish what connectionism is, and pretty much what it proposes that learning is a product between stimulus and response. We experience something, we have a word for it, that's how we feel, that's what comes out. Furthermore, though, there have been many studies on linguistics with the connections approach, but rarely on sign language implications. I've had a hard time finding some. And although work is lacking, we can perhaps look at the trace model and look at how Nicaraguan Sign Language is using some sort of trace model in their language. So as we can see here, we have features, right? These are the things we see. These are perhaps the things that we hear. Now, with Nicaraguan Sign Language and sign language in general, we don't have features of sound. We only have features of vision. And so we'll get these features, right? And of course, we don't have phenoms. We don't have letters in Nicaraguan Sign Language. This can be gestures, right? And so perhaps we'll see a wheel, and this will be a wheel. Perhaps we'll see a house, and this triangle will depict a house, something like that. The phenoms will come as our gestures. And at the end, words are gestures having a meaning to them. When we do this, we know it's a wheel. When we do this, we know it's a pyramid or a house, whatever it can be. That's how the trace model, a connectionist approach model can be used to see how NSL is conducted by each other. And so pretty much the trace model is the connectionist model consists of 3 layers of neurons. You can see the features, phenoms, and words used to represent auditory, phonemic, and word-specific information. And as we depicted, there can be a trace model for Nicaraguan Sign Language if we modify some of the things. And we can see how children are segmenting and linearizing the Nicaraguan Sign Language and sign language in general. And so moving forward, we have our final thoughts and our value field for cognitive science. So first of all, there is a huge appreciation towards Nicaraguan Sign Language. What they're doing there is amazing. And what researchers are also doing there is incredible. We're actually seeing a sign language, a new one formed from these people, right? From their own experience in a connectionist approach. They're feeling some sort of stimulus and they're outputting what they're feeling. Every new generation, the driving force and the growth of Nicaraguan Sign Language is exponentially increasing at a faster rate than one can look at English, right? Like I previously said, yes, in English, it's a language that's been established, but every year a new generation of people are coming in with new words, new slang, new acronyms, new things. Social media is a driving factor for it. And so you can also see the connection to younger children having an impact in that language. Also, developments into the child's brain, as discussed in our article too. Perhaps we should somehow see how deaf children are understanding sign language. Obviously, it's a little harder, but if we can have some sort of, a child at birth that is deaf, and for some reason the child is, sign language is being taught sign language up until like, let's say 2 years, where they can perhaps communicate with each other. I would want to see how, what part of their brain is lighting up when they see these gestures, and is it similar to those that are being lit up at a baby's brain at 11 months? Obviously, the age difference varies, but I believe the brain activity should still be along the same. And another thing is more study needs to be done on sign language, especially in a connectionist approach. Like I said, especially with Nicaragua, this is a huge opportunity for researchers to, gather information, how much this is changing. I would love to see like some sort of decade study where every decade they're checking up on the Nicaraguans and how their sign language is progressing from last decade to this decade. Keep it going and see how much the driving force of the children in each generation is actually, increasing the use of it, and how much more progression they have with their linearizing and the structuring of the sign language that they're inputting. And this also ties to the better connections approach study to sign language. And how can this now be approached to create a verbal language? So obviously it's be a little difficult to conduct this research, but how would people be able to communicate with one another if they don't know any language? And although this would be a little bit harder to conduct, perhaps getting a person that only speaks Spanish, a person that only speaks Russian, and a person that only speaks Japanese, languages that perhaps have very little ties in it. How would they be able to communicate with another within a period of time where they would be isolated and they had to work with one another? Obviously, you would also theoretically see sign language also come into place. And we know when you don't understand, sign language is something that everybody can understand. And so, there's more implications toward this that can be done in the future. But for now, I believe that we're at a very good spot. And I believe sign language can teach us so much about cognition and connectionism in development to verbal language as a whole. And with that being said, that is my presentation on this article. Here are my reference page for any of the articles. Perhaps you may find one of them interesting for yourself to take a look at and read. I highly recommend either the Brain Science of Bilingualism, found that one very fascinating, or perhaps do you want to go, I'm not sure which one you did in your presentation. I found two. and they were both equally about the same significant meaning to them. And the study, I believe the second one followed up on the first one. So you want to take a look at that. I would, Professor, I would encourage you to do that. Very good study. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the presentation. That is it for me. Thank you for a good semester, and I'll see you next semester. I'm taking a class with you yet again. So thank you again, Professor.